It was a quiet evening, the kind where the street seemed almost too calm. Officer Ryan Matthews had been patrolling the same suburban neighborhood for years, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the cool breeze that carried an eerie silence, or maybe it was just his gut telling him something wasn't quite right. Either way, he kept his eyes sharp as he drove slowly down the empty roads. That's when he saw it, a black hearse speeding through the intersection without stopping. It wasn't every day you saw a funeral car racing like it was late for its own appointment. The sight immediately caught Ryan's attention. He frowned and slowed his cruiser, watching as the hearse swerved slightly between lanes before picking up even more speed. Something about the whole situation didn't sit well with him. Ryan hesitated for only a moment before flipping on his siren and pulling out behind the vehicle. If there was one thing he'd learned in his years on the force, it was to trust his instincts. And right now they were screaming at him to find out what was going on inside that hearse. The driver of the hearse must have noticed the flashing lights because he reluctantly eased the vehicle to the side of the road. As Ryan approached, he couldn't help but notice how ordinary the car looked. Plain black paint, no logos or markings to indicate which funeral home it belonged to. That struck him as odd. Most hearses had some sort of branding on them, but this one was completely unmarked. When Ryan reached the driver's window, the man rolled it down just enough to peer out nervously. His hair was messy, like he hadn't combed it in days, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Evening, officer," the man said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Is there a problem?" Ryan leaned down, resting his forearms on the doorframe. "You tell me," he replied calmly. "Why were you speeding? And why didn't you stop at the last intersection?" The driver shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I guess I wasn't paying attention. Long day, you know?" He offered a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something off about him, something Ryan couldn't quite put his finger on yet. "License and registration, please," Ryan said, holding out his hand. The driver fumbled around in the glove compartment for a moment before handing over the requested documents. While Ryan examined them, he glanced toward the back of the hearse. Through the tinted windows, he could make out the shape of a coffin strapped securely in place. Normally, seeing a coffin wouldn't raise any alarms. It was, after all, standard cargo for a hearse. But tonight, everything about this situation felt wrong. Why would someone be driving so recklessly with a coffin in tow? And why did the driver seem so jumpy? Ryan handed the papers back to the man and stepped closer to the rear of the vehicle. "Open it up," he said firmly, pointing to the back doors. The driver's face went pale. "What? You can't be serious. That's disrespectful." "I'm serious," Ryan shot back, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now open it." Reluctantly, the driver climbed out of the car and walked to the back of the hearse. His hands trembled as he unlocked the doors and swung them open. Then, with visible hesitation, he unlatched the lid of the coffin and pushed it upward. For a split second, Ryan froze. What he saw inside wasn't what anyone would expect to find in a coffin. Instead of a lifeless body lying peacefully, there was a young woman very much alive, though clearly terrified. Her mouth was gagged, her wrists bound with rope, and her wide eyes darted around frantically as if searching for help. Ryan's heart sank as he took in the scene. Without wasting another second, he drew his gun and pointed it at the driver. "Step away from the hearse," he commanded, his voice steady despite the shock coursing through him. The driver froze, panic washing over his face. For a moment it seemed like he might try to run, but then he raised his hands slowly and backed away from the vehicle. Ryan quickly called for backup while keeping a close eye on the man. Inside the coffin, the young woman continued to struggle, weakly against her restraints, tears streaming down her cheeks. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Ryan felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone use a coffin, a symbol of death and mourning, as a tool for such cruelty? Who was this man, and why was he transporting a living person like this? More importantly, who else might be involved? Within minutes, backup arrived, and paramedics carefully lifted the young woman out of the coffin. She was shaken but otherwise unharmed, though it would take time for her to recover from the trauma she'd endured. Meanwhile, Ryan handcuffed the driver and started asking questions, determined to get answers. Though the night had started like any other, it had quickly turned into something far darker, and far more important, than Ryan could have imagined. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a case that would uncover secrets far beyond what he'd ever expected. The young woman sat huddled in the back of an ambulance, wrapped tightly in a blanket despite the warm evening air. Her hands were finally free from the ropes that had bound them, but her eyes still darted around nervously, as if she expected danger to appear at any moment. Paramedics checked her over, assuring her she was safe now, but it was clear that the ordeal had left its mark on her. She wasn't ready to talk yet. Her voice was gone, swallowed by fear and exhaustion, but her trembling body spoke volumes about what she'd been through. Officer Ryan stood nearby, watching her closely while keeping one hand firmly on the shoulder of the man who had driven the hearse. The driver, still cuffed, looked defeated, his earlier nervousness replaced by a hollow resignation. He kept glancing toward the ground, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially the young woman. It was obvious he knew this was bad, worse than bad, but Ryan could tell there was more to the story. This wasn't just some random act of cruelty. Something bigger was at play here. Once backup officers secured the scene and began processing evidence, Ryan decided it was time to get answers. He led the driver to the back of a police cruiser, where they could speak privately without distractions. The man slumped into the seat, his head hanging low. Ryan leaned against the car door, crossing his arms as he studied him carefully. "All right," Ryan said, his voice firm but controlled. "You've got two choices here. You can either sit there and pretend you don't know anything, or you can start talking and maybe help yourself out. Which is it gonna be?" The driver hesitated, chewing on his lip like he was weighing his options. Finally, he let out a shaky sigh and muttered, "I didn't want to do it, okay? I didn't have a choice." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Didn't have a choice? That's not how this works. You don't get to kidnap people and hide them in coffins unless you're making some pretty big choices along the way. So let's try again. Who put you up to this?" The man glanced around anxiously as if afraid someone might overhear. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush. "It's not just me, all right? There's a guy. Everyone calls him Victor. He pays us, he pays me to transport people. I mean, not people. Victims. They're already taken when I get involved. All I do is drive the hearse. That's it." Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. "Victor," he repeated slowly. "And what exactly does Victor do with these victims after you drop them off?" The driver shook his head, refusing to meet Ryan's gaze. "I don't ask questions, I swear, I just follow orders, but I think they hold them somewhere. Remote places, usually. Abandoned buildings, warehouses, stuff like that. After that..." His voice trailed off and he swallowed hard. "Look, I don't know what happens next, I don't want to know." Ryan leaned in closer, his tone sharpening. "How many times have you done this?" The man hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable, answering, "A few. Maybe 5 or 6 times, maybe more. I lose count." "And you never thought to say no?" Ryan pressed, his frustration mounting. "To walk away? To call the cops?" The driver's face twisted in anger, though it wasn't directed at Ryan. "You think I haven't tried? You think I wanted this life? Every time I even hinted at backing out, they made sure I understood the consequences. Threats, warnings. Once they sent me pictures of my family, my kids, just to remind me what would happen if I stepped out of line." Ryan clenched his jaw, trying to process the weight of what he was hearing. This wasn't just a lone criminal acting on impulse. It was organized, calculated, and ruthless. Whoever Victor was, he wasn't working alone. There was a whole operation behind this, one that spanned far beyond what Ryan had initially imagined. Back at the station, things moved quickly. Investigators took over questioning the driver, piecing together every detail he could provide. Meanwhile, the young woman from the coffin began to open up, sharing fragments of her story between sobs. She explained that she had been walking, home late one night when a van pulled up beside her. Before she could react, masked men jumped out and dragged her inside. From there, everything became a blur. Days spent locked in dark rooms, blindfolded and terrified, until she woke up in the coffin. Her account matched parts of what the driver had revealed. She was being held for ransom, targeted because her family refused to pay the initial demand. But unlike others before her, she hadn't been delivered to the final destination yet. Thanks to Ryan's instincts and the routine traffic stop, she had been spared whatever fate awaited her. As the hours passed, investigators dug deeper into the driver's confession. Phone records, GPS data from the Hearse, and financial transactions all pointed to a network far larger than anyone had anticipated. Several high-profile individuals appeared to be connected, including lawyers, business owners, and even local politicians. Each played a role in facilitating the operation, whether knowingly or unknowingly, ensuring that the trafficking ring remained hidden from public view. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came when analysts uncovered a pattern linking multiple cases across several states. Victims had been snatched off streets, abducted from their homes, or lured under false pretenses, only to vanish without a trace. Until now, authorities had struggled to connect the dots, dismissing each case as isolated incidents. But thanks to the driver's cooperation and the evidence found during the Hearse stop, they finally had enough to piece together the full picture. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Local media outlets picked up the story, broadcasting details of the shocking discovery to the public. Parents hugged their children tighter, neighbors exchanged worried glances, and community leaders demanded action. For too long, this shadowy network had operated in silence, preying on the vulnerable and exploiting loopholes in the system. Now, thanks to one officer's decision to trust his gut, the truth was coming to light. For Ryan, however, the work was far from over. As he stared at the growing pile of files on his desk, he couldn't shake the image of the young woman in the coffin, the terror in her eyes, the desperation in her movements. He knew that catching one driver and uncovering part of the operation wasn't enough. Not when there were still others out there, trapped and waiting for someone to find them. With renewed determination, Ryan vowed to see this through to the end. No matter how deep the rabbit hole went, no matter how powerful the people involved might be, he wouldn't rest until justice was served, for the victims, for their families, and for everyone who deserved to live without fear. The station buzzed with activity as investigators worked tirelessly to untangle the web of lies and corruption surrounding Victor's operation. Files were scattered across desks, phones rang nonstop, and officers moved quickly from one task to the next. It was clear that this case wasn't just about catching one man. It was about dismantling an entire network of exploitation and greed. And at the center of it all stood Officer Ryan, determined to ensure no stone was left unturned. With the driver cooperating in exchange for leniency, new leads poured in almost hourly. Phone records revealed a string of coded messages between the driver and someone named Victor. These messages often included GPS coordinates or vague descriptions of locations, likely drop-off points for victims. Financial transactions showed large sums of money being transferred through shell companies, masking the true source of funding. The deeper they dug, the more complex the operation appeared to be. One piece of information stood out among the rest. A specific address mentioned repeatedly in the driver's logs. It belonged to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, far enough away from prying eyes to remain unnoticed. According to the driver, this location had been used multiple times over the past year as a holding site before victims were moved to their final destinations. If anyone inside the network knew what was happening, they'd be there tonight. Ryan gathered his team and laid out the plan. They would conduct a raid under the cover of darkness, hoping to catch whoever was inside off guard. Time was critical. If word got out that law enforcement was onto them, the perpetrators could scatter, taking any remaining hostages with them. Ryan stressed the importance of precision and coordination. This wasn't just another bust. Innocent. Lives depended on their success. As night fell, the SWAT team assembled outside the warehouse, armed and ready. Flashlights cut through the darkness as officers positioned themselves strategically around the building. Ryan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He couldn't shake the image of the young woman in the coffin, the terror in her eyes, and he reminded himself why they were here. Failure wasn't an option. Inside the warehouse, chaos erupted within seconds of the raid beginning. Officers breached the doors, shouting commands as gunfire echoed through the cavernous space. Men scrambled to flee, some attempting to fight back while others tried to slip away unnoticed. But Ryan and his team were prepared. They moved swiftly, cornering suspects and securing the area room by room. In one particularly tense moment, Ryan found himself face to face with a man clutching a weapon. The suspect hesitated, clearly unsure whether to surrender or resist. Ryan didn't give him time to decide. He tackled him to the ground, pinning him down until backup arrived to cuff him. Adrenaline coursed through Ryan's veins, but he forced himself to stay focused. Every second counted. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the situation was under control. Dozens of men and women were rounded up, their faces etched with fear and defiance. Tables littered with documents, laptops, and burner phones provided further evidence of the operation's scale. But it was what they discovered in the basement that truly shocked everyone. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators stumbled upon two more hostages, both women, bound and gagged, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief when they realized they were being rescued. One of them sobbed uncontrollably as paramedics gently freed her from her restraints, while the other simply stared ahead, too overwhelmed to react. Both were rushed to safety, where they would later recount harrowing stories of abduction, captivity, and unimaginable fear. As dawn broke, Ryan stood outside the warehouse watching as suspects were loaded into police vans. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but so did a sense of accomplishment. They had struck a major blow against Victor's operation, saving lives in the process. Still, Ryan knew this victory was only partial. Victor himself remained at large, and until he was caught, the threat wouldn't fully disappear. Back at the station, the rescued women began to share their experiences, each story more heartbreaking than the last. One explained that she had been walking home late at night when a van pulled up beside her. Before she could react, masked men dragged her inside and blindfolded her. For days, she was held in various locations, never knowing where she was or who might come for her next. She had lost hope of ever seeing her family again, until the raid gave her a second chance. Another woman recounted how she had been lured online by someone posing as a potential employer. What started as a promising job opportunity turned into a nightmare when she arrived at what she thought was an interview location. Instead, she was abducted and locked away, her captors demanding ransom payments from her relatives. Her voice cracked as she described the loneliness and despair of those weeks, wondering if anyone even knew she was missing. Their testimonies painted a grim picture of Victor's methods, targeting vulnerable individuals, exploiting their trust, and using intimidation to keep them silent. Each victim represented not just a life disrupted, but a family torn apart. The emotional toll was immeasurable, and Ryan couldn't help but feel anger bubbling beneath the surface. How could anyone justify such cruelty? Despite the progress made, questions lingered. Who exactly was Victor? Was he the mastermind behind everything, or merely a figurehead for an even larger organization? Investigators combed through seized documents and electronic devices, searching for clues that might lead them closer to answers. Meanwhile, analysts worked to connect the dots between known associates and suspected accomplices, building a comprehensive profile of the network. Public outrage grew as details of the scandal emerged. News outlets reported extensively on the case, shining a light on the dark underbelly of human trafficking. Protesters gathered outside courthouses, demanding justice for the victims and accountability for those involved. Community leaders called for stricter laws and better resources to combat similar crimes in the future. For once, the issue couldn't be ignored. It was front and center, impossible to look away from. Amidst the whirlwind of activity, Ryan allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought about the young woman in the coffin, the hostages in the basement, and all the others whose lives had been shattered by Victor's greed. Then he thought about the countless hours spent chasing leads, the sleepless nights, and the sacrifices made along the way. None of it mattered compared to the lives saved, he reminded himself. That was the mission, plain and simple. But Ryan also knew the fight wasn't over. As long as Victor remained free, the danger persisted. Somewhere out there, he was regrouping, planning his next move. And Ryan vowed, not just to himself but to the victims, that he wouldn't stop until Victor was brought to justice. Whatever it took, however long it lasted, he would see this through to the end. For now, though, Ryan allowed himself a small smile. Against all odds, they had succeeded tonight. Lives had been saved, criminals had been arrested, and the truth had come to light. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and sometimes that was enough. The days following the raid on the warehouse were a blur of activity. Investigators worked around the clock, piecing together evidence and connecting the dots between the suspects they had arrested. Every document, every phone record, every scrap of information was scrutinized for clues that could lead them closer to Victor, the shadowy figure pulling the strings behind the operation. Officer Ryan found himself at the center of it all, juggling interviews, strategy meetings, and updates from analysts. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to let it slow him down. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when forensic experts analyzed the laptops and burner phones seized during the raid. Hidden within encrypted files were detailed logs of transactions, schedules, and even photos of victims. These weren't just random snapshots, they were carefully cataloged, each image accompanied by notes about ransom demands, family contacts, and drop-off locations. It became clear that this wasn't some amateur operation. It was a highly organized machine designed to exploit people for profit. What struck Ryan most was the sheer scale of it. The network spanned multiple states with different teams handling various stages of the process. Some were responsible for abductions, others for transportation, and still others for holding victims until ransoms were paid. Each group operated independently, communicating only through coded messages or intermediaries to avoid detection. This level of compartmentalization made it incredibly difficult to trace everything back to its source, but not impossible. As investigators dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. Several high-profile individuals appeared repeatedly in financial records, funneling money into shell companies used to fund the operation. Lawyers drafted fake contracts to legitimize illegal activities. Business owners provided storage spaces or vehicles to move victims unnoticed. Even local politicians seemed implicated, turning a blind eye in exchange for kickbacks or favors. The corruption ran deep, reaching far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Public outrage reached a fever pitch as more details surfaced. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting the audacity of the crime ring and the suffering endured by its victims. Protesters gathered outside courthouses, demanding justice not only for those directly involved, but also for the systemic failures that allowed such atrocities to happen unchecked. Community leaders called for sweeping reforms, urging lawmakers to strengthen anti-trafficking laws and allocate more resources to law enforcement agencies. For Ryan, the pressure mounted. He knew the public was counting on him to deliver results, and so were the victims. Many of them had begun opening up about their experiences, sharing stories that painted a vivid picture of fear, isolation, and despair. One woman described how she had been snatched off the street while walking home late one night. Another recounted being lured online by someone posing as a potential employer. Both spoke of the psychological toll, the constant uncertainty, the feeling of helplessness, the moments when they thought they might never see their loved ones again. Listening to these accounts only fueled Ryan's determination. He spent hours reviewing case files, cross-referencing data, and brainstorming strategies with his team. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued relentlessly. They tracked down former associates of the arrested suspects, interviewing anyone who might have knowledge of Victor's whereabouts. They monitored communication channels, hoping to intercept any attempts to regroup or relocate. And they worked tirelessly to build a solid case against everyone implicated in the operation. But catching Victor proved to be a challenge unlike anything Ryan had faced before. The man was a ghost, always one step ahead, leaving behind just enough breadcrumbs to keep investigators chasing shadows. Phone records showed frequent changes in devices and numbers, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint his exact location. Surveillance footage from known drop-off sites revealed little more than fleeting glimpses of cars speeding away. Even the driver who had cooperated couldn't provide much beyond vague descriptions and second-hand rumors. Despite the setbacks, Ryan refused to give up. He reminded himself why he had joined law enforcement in the first place: to protect people, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Each victim rescued, each criminal brought to justice, was a victory worth fighting for. So he pushed forward, leaning on his team for support and drawing strength from the resilience of the survivors. One evening, as Ryan pored over yet another stack of documents, something caught his eye. A name mentioned briefly in one of the coded messages. It wasn't much, but it was new. A low-level associate referred to someone as the broker, describing them as the go-between for Victor and the rest of the network. Could this be the break they needed? Ryan immediately flagged it for further investigation, instructing analysts to dig deeper into any connections tied to the alias. Meanwhile, efforts to dismantle the broader operation continued. Dozens of arrests were made across several states, targeting key players in the trafficking ring. Warehouses, safe houses, and makeshift holding facilities were raided, freeing additional hostages who had been held for weeks, or even months, in horrific conditions. Families reunited with loved ones amid tears of joy and relief, grateful for the chance to start healing. Yet, despite the progress, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Victor remained elusive, slipping through their fingers time and again. Was he hiding in plain sight, blending into society like so many criminals before him? Or had he fled entirely, abandoning his empire to start anew elsewhere? Either way, Ryan vowed not to stop until he had answers. In quieter moments, Ryan reflected on how far they'd come since that fateful night when he pulled over the hearse. What had started as a routine traffic stop had snowballed into one of the largest human trafficking investigations in recent history. Lives had been saved, criminals brought to justice, and light shone on a dark corner of society that had long gone unnoticed. But for Ryan, the work wasn't done, not until Victor was behind bars. As dawn broke over the city, Ryan stood outside the precinct, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise. Exhaustion tugged at him, but so did hope. He thought about the young woman in the coffin, the hostages in the basement, and all the others whose lives had been forever changed by Victor's greed. Then he thought about the future, a future where no one else would suffer the same fate. That vision kept him going, pushing him to fight harder, smarter, and longer than ever before. And so, with renewed resolve, Ryan stepped back inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because sometimes justice isn't just about solving a case, it's about changing lives. And Ryan wasn't about to let anyone stand in the way of that. The courtroom was packed to the brim, with every seat occupied and people spilling into the aisles. Reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks, cameras clicked incessantly, and whispers filled the air like a restless tide. This wasn't just another trial. It was the culmination of months of tireless investigation, heart-wrenching testimonies, and relentless pursuit of justice. Today, the world would finally see the faces behind one of the most heinous human trafficking rings ever uncovered. Victor, the man who had once been nothing more than a shadowy name whispered in hushed tones, now sat at the defendant's table. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding him. Dressed in an expensive suit, his hair neatly combed, he looked more like a corporate executive than a criminal mastermind. But appearances could be deceiving. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Coded messages, financial records, surveillance, footage, and the damning testimonies of those who had worked under him. There was no denying his role in orchestrating the operation that had ruined so many lives. Beside him sat dozens of others implicated in the network: drivers, handlers, corrupt officials, and even a few high-profile individuals whose names had graced headlines for years. Some stared blankly ahead, resigned to their fate. Others fidgeted nervously, glancing toward the crowd as if searching for allies or escape routes. Each of them carried a piece of the puzzle, but it was Victor who held the key to the entire operation. As the proceedings began, the prosecutor took center stage, laying out the case in painstaking detail. He described how victims were abducted from streets, homes, and workplaces, lured by false promises or snatched without warning. He recounted the horrors endured by those held captive, blindfolded, bound, and locked away in dark, isolated spaces, unsure if they'd ever see daylight again. And he painted a vivid picture of the greed and cruelty that fueled the ring, driven by men and women who saw human beings not as people, but as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited. One by one, the survivors stepped forward to share their stories. Their voices trembled, but their words carried weight. A young woman spoke of being taken while walking home late at night, her life turned upside down in an instant. Another described how she had trusted what seemed like a legitimate job offer, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare. Tears streamed down their faces as they relived the fear, the helplessness, the moments when they thought they'd never make it out alive. But there was also strength in their words, a determination to ensure no one else suffered the same fate. The impact on the courtroom was palpable. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, visibly moved by the raw emotion pouring from the witness stand. Family members of the victims clung to each other, some sobbing quietly, others nodding along in solidarity. Even seasoned reporters paused mid-sentence, struck by the gravity of what they were witnessing. For the first time, the full scope of the operation was laid bare, not just as a series of crimes, but as a violation of humanity itself. Victor listened silently, his expression unreadable. Occasionally, he glanced toward his lawyer, whispering, something too low for anyone else to hear. But for the most part, he remained stoic, as though detached from the devastation unfolding around him. It was a calculated move, Ryan realized, designed to project innocence or at least indifference. But Ryan knew better. Beneath that polished exterior lay a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. Throughout the trial, Ryan sat near the back of the room, observing everything. He hadn't expected to feel nervous, after all. The evidence was ironclad, and the survivors' testimonies were compelling. Yet, as the days dragged on, doubt crept in. What if Victor somehow managed to slip through the cracks? What if his connections, his money, his influence proved stronger than justice? These thoughts gnawed at Ryan, keeping him awake at night despite his exhaustion. But then something remarkable happened. Midway through the trial, one of Victor's former associates, a man who had initially denied involvement, decided to cooperate fully with authorities. In exchange for leniency, he provided explosive new details about the inner workings of the operation. He revealed secret meetings, hidden safe houses, and even specific instructions given by Victor himself. Most damning of all, he produced recordings of phone calls where Victor discussed ransom payments and drop-off locations in chilling detail. When these recordings were played in court, the effect was electric. Gasps rippled through the audience as Victor's voice filled the room, cold and calculating, discussing plans that amounted to little more than modern-day slavery. For the first time, the mask slipped. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his composure cracking ever so slightly. It was a small victory, but one that sent a clear message. The walls were closing in. As closing arguments approached, tensions reached a breaking point. The prosecution delivered a powerful summation, urging the jury to consider not just the law, but the moral implications of their decision. "This isn't just about punishing criminals," the prosecutor said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about sending a message that we will not tolerate this kind of evil in our society, that we will fight for the vulnerable, protect the innocent, and hold accountable those who prey on others." The defense countered with technicalities, questioning the reliability of evidence and arguing that Victor couldn't have known the extent of the operation. But their efforts felt hollow, drowned out by the sheer volume of proof stacked against them. When the final statements concluded, the jury retired to deliberate, leaving the rest of the courtroom in tense silence. Hours passed before the verdict was announced. When the foreman stood to deliver the decision, the room fell so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Guilty. One by one, the charges were read aloud. Kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, extortion, and with each guilty verdict, a collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. Justice had been served. For Ryan, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt pride knowing that his instincts, his persistence, and his team's hard work had led to this outcome. On the other hand, he couldn't forget the pain endured by the survivors or the lives forever altered by the operation. As the judge handed down lengthy prison sentences for Victor and his accomplices, Ryan reminded himself that this was only part of the battle. The scars left behind would take years to heal, if they ever did. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted as news of the verdict spread. Protesters who had gathered daily to demand accountability hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Community leaders praised the courage of the survivors and vowed to continue fighting for systemic change. For a brief moment, it felt like hope had triumphed over despair. But Ryan knew better than to let his guard down completely. Human trafficking wasn't going to disappear overnight. Networks like Victor's operated globally, adapting and evolving to evade capture. Still, today marked a significant step forward, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, light could shine through. As Ryan walked away from the courthouse, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the young woman in the coffin, the hostages in the basement, and all the others whose lives had intersected with his own during this journey. Then he thought about the future, a future where perhaps fewer people would suffer because of what had been achieved here today. With renewed purpose, Ryan climbed into his cruiser and drove off, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because justice wasn't just about solving cases, it was about making the world a safer place one step at a time, and Ryan wasn't done yet. Months after the trial ended, life in the city began to settle into a new rhythm. The headlines that once screamed about Victor and his trafficking ring slowly faded, replaced by other stories vying for attention. But for Officer Ryan, the echoes of the case lingered. It wasn't just the late nights spent poring over evidence or the adrenaline-fueled raids, it was the people, the survivors whose courage had changed everything. Their faces stayed with him, reminders of why he wore the badge. Victor and his accomplices were now behind bars, sentenced to decades without parole. For many, this was closure, a chance to breathe easier knowing these predators couldn't hurt anyone else. But Ryan knew better than most that justice didn't erase scars. The young woman found in the coffin still struggled with nightmares. The hostages rescued from the warehouse flinched at sudden noises. Families torn apart by kidnappings worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and connection. Healing took time, and Ryan vowed to support them however he could. In the wake of the case, Ryan became a voice for change. He joined forces with community leaders, advocacy groups, and lawmakers to push for stronger protections against human trafficking. Public awareness campaigns sprang up across the city, educating people on how to spot warning signs and report suspicious activity. Schools held workshops for students, teaching them about online safety and the dangers of trusting strangers too easily. Even local businesses got involved, offering resources and funding to organizations helping survivors rebuild their lives. Ryan also spearheaded the creation of a special task force dedicated to combating human trafficking. Made up of seasoned officers, analysts, and social workers, the unit focused on dismantling networks like Victor's before they could grow. They shared intelligence with agencies nationwide, building partnerships to tackle the problem on a larger scale. Training sessions became routine, equipping officers with tools to recognize subtle clues like an unmarked hearse speeding through town that might otherwise go unnoticed. For Ryan, leading the task force felt like a natural next step. It gave him purpose beyond patrolling streets and writing tickets. Every day brought new challenges but also opportunities to make a real difference. Whether it was rescuing victims, arresting criminals, or simply listening to someone share their story, Ryan approached each moment with humility and determination. He never forgot that his job wasn't just about catching bad guys, it was about protecting people. One evening, as Ryan sat in his office reviewing case files, There was a soft knock at the door. He looked up to see the young woman who had been found in the coffin standing there, hesitantly clutching a small bouquet of flowers. Her presence caught him off guard. She had attended therapy sessions and counseling programs since her rescue, but she rarely spoke publicly about her experience. Seeing her here now, looking healthier and more confident, filled Ryan with a quiet pride. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said softly, her voice steadier than he remembered. "I just wanted to thank you." Ryan stood quickly, gesturing for her to come in. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, though warmth spread through his chest. "I was just doing my job." She shook her head firmly. "No, you weren't. You went above and beyond. If you hadn't stopped that hearse when you did." Her voice trailed off, but the gratitude in her eyes said enough. She placed the flowers on his desk, smiled shyly, and turned to leave. Before she reached the door, Ryan called out, "Wait." She paused, glancing back at him. "How are you doing? Really?" For a moment she hesitated, then nodded. "Better. It's hard sometimes, but I'm getting there, thanks to you and everyone else who helped." Her words stayed with Ryan long after she left. They reminded him that while justice mattered, so did compassion. Survivors needed more than arrests and convictions. They needed support, understanding, and a chance to reclaim their lives. That realization fueled his commitment to the task force and its mission. As weeks turned into months, Ryan noticed subtle shifts in the community. Neighbors started looking out for one another, reporting odd behaviors or unfamiliar vehicles parked where they shouldn't be. Parents grew more vigilant, teaching their children about stranger danger and safe practices. Local shelters saw an increase in volunteers eager to assist vulnerable populations. Slowly but surely, the city was becoming a safer place. Not because fear ruled, but because people cared. Still, Ryan remained acutely aware that the fight wasn't over. Human trafficking was a global issue, and dismantling one network didn't mean the threat disappeared entirely. New players emerged, adapting tactics to stay ahead of law enforcement. Technology created both opportunities and risks, making it easier to exploit victims while complicating efforts to track criminals. But Ryan refused to let discouragement creep in. Instead, he embraced innovation, working with tech experts to develop tools that identified patterns and flagged potential threats faster than ever before. Late one night, as Ryan drove home from work, he passed the spot where he'd pulled over the hearse all those months ago. The road was empty now, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly silhouette of a coffin. Instead, he saw only the reflection of his own face, weathered by sleepless nights but resolute. He thought about the journey he'd been on, the shock of discovering a living person inside a coffin, the relentless pursuit of justice, the triumph of seeing Victor sentenced, and the ongoing battle to protect others. Each step had tested him, pushed him to his limits, and forced him to confront the darkest corners of humanity. Yet through it all, he had discovered something profound. Light existed even in the deepest shadows, especially when people chose to stand together. When Ryan finally arrived home, he parked his car and stepped outside. The cool night air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, a reminder of the bouquet left on his desk earlier. As he locked up and headed inside, he allowed himself a rare smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, and new chances to make a difference, and Ryan was ready. Because sometimes being a hero isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes it's about showing up day after day, doing what's right and refusing to give up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. For Ryan, that was enough.